Welcome to the Tuesday, May 12th edition of Mark Madness. Yesterday, I asked you to read all of Mark chapter 10 to get an overview of where Mark is taking us. If you remember, we're in the midst of Mark 8 through 10, in which Mark is really trying to answer two questions. First, what type of Messiah is Jesus? In the first 8 chapters, we've established that Jesus is king, that Jesus is Messiah. But what kind of Messiah? We're going to see that he is a suffering, serving Messiah. Jesus talks about this in Mark 8. He talks about it in Mark 9, and we're going to see it again in Mark chapter 10. But the other question that is really going on in these chapters is, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ? Not only what type of Christ is Jesus, but what does it mean to follow this Christ? And you remember it all began in Mark 8:34, where Jesus says, "Deny yourselves, take up your cross, and follow me." And that's the big picture of what it means to be a disciple. In chapter 10, Mark gives a few examples of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And today he talks about marriage in Mark 10, 1 through 12. And you have to understand the background to set up the scene, because Jesus is encountering not a genuine question, but verse 2 says the Pharisees are testing Jesus. The Pharisees are really trying to snooker him into saying something wrong or saying something blasphemous so they can keep coming after him. So you have to keep that in mind. So when Jesus engages this discussion, he's not going to answer every possible question on marriage and divorce, because he knows he's interacting with a hostile crowd. But they ask the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And they ask this for a couple of reasons. One, Deuteronomy 24 says that if a man finds something objectionable in his wife, then he can give her a certificate of divorce and send her along the way. In Jesus' day, there were several views of how to interpret this command. What does it mean to find something objectionable? Rabbi Shammai says the only objectionable thing is adultery. If the wife commits sexual immorality, then the husband can divorce her. Rabbi Hillel was a much more liberal rabbi who basically said you can divorce your wife for any reason. He says if she does so much as burns the food that she's cooking for you, you can divorce her. There was a third rabbi who was kind of in that same camp who said if you find a woman more beautiful than your wife, then you can divorce her. And then they turn to Jesus with all of these ideas about divorce floating around. And they say, Jesus, what do you say? Can a man divorce his wife? And there's a few things that Jesus says. First, he argues that the only reason that Moses gave permission for divorce in the first place was because he understands that people are sinful. And he understands the sin that can enter a relationship. Really, though, God's design, as Jesus goes back to creation and starts quoting Genesis 2, is that a man and woman would come together for life. God's design, where if sin were to never enter, would be that marriage is a relationship that lasts a lifetime. The reason divorce only comes up is because of sinfulness and brokenness. Jesus here, as he explains this, basically says it's not right to divorce. God created marriage to be permanent, and that's the end of the story. The only reason that Moses let you ever divorce was because he knows that you're a sinful, broken people. Now, it's important to note that in a similar passage in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus does give one exception for divorce, and that is sexual immorality. That is, if someone commits adultery, then divorce is permissible. There's one other thing that the Bible talks about pretty clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. The Apostle Paul talks about when a non-believer abandons their spouse. And this abandonment is interpreted in different ways. Is it just a physical leaving? Does it include physical abuse and things like that? So Jesus in Mark 10 doesn't give any exceptions But the New Testament and other places, including Jesus' own words in Matthew chapter 19, he does give at least a couple of exceptions. I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of all of the details of this because I realize that marriage and divorce is not what a lot of you are thinking about right now. You're not even thinking about that far ahead or things like that. But I want to take a step back to see what this says about relationships. And remember, Jesus is a sacrificial, serving Messiah. Jesus expects his followers to be sacrificial and serving in their relationships. Some of the popular opinions that were going around in that day about divorce were so self-serving. They were simply, if my wife doesn't cook the way I want her to, or if I find somebody more beautiful than she is. How selfish and arrogant is that? Not only that, but in the Jewish culture, it was on the man that could divorce. The women didn't even have rights. Now, that's not true in the Greco-Roman culture. In Greco-Roman culture, there were more rights for women, but in a historically Jewish culture, in the ancient Near East, there were not many women's rights. And to divorce a woman would be to abandon her. It would be to leave her disconnected and disenfranchised. And so, really, what Jesus is getting to, and there are important discussions about the specifics of marriage and divorce, but he's talking at the core about what our relationships are supposed to be like. We are supposed to love, we are supposed to be committed to one another. We are supposed to love others as we love ourselves. We're supposed to love others sacrificially. We're supposed to serve others. You know, some of the primary reasons that friendships, relationships, and even marriages end today are simply for selfish and self-serving reasons. Because we have a utilitarian view of relationships. We want relationships that benefit us. We want relationships that serve us. And when they stop fulfilling that role, then relationships are disposable. We can get rid of friendships. We can get rid of boyfriends and girlfriends. We can get rid of husbands and wives. And Jesus is calling us to something much more significant than that. Relationships are not utilitarian. Relationships are not about simply getting our needs met. Relationships are about sacrifice. They're about commitment. They're about serving one another. That's what makes for a good friendship. That's the type of boyfriend or girlfriend you want. And that's the type of marriage you should enter into. It's also a warning, I think, not to enter into relationships too lightly, right? Not to just jump into them for any silly reason, especially marriage, because marriage is intended by God to last a lifetime. And it's supposed to be a committed relationship of loving service and sacrifice, because relationships take sacrifice. What do we want out of friendships? We don't want people that are going to abandon us at the first thing we do wrong. We don't want people in our lives who are just going to forget about us when things get difficult. We want people to be committed to us. We want people to sacrifice on our behalf, and we need to do that for them as well. I realize I'm not saying everything there is to say about relationships, because Jesus doesn't say everything there is to say about relationships in this passage. But I do think the whole idea of denying ourselves, of being sacrificial, of being a servant, of being committed to the other, rather than simply having everything be about us and our desires, that's the right attitude we have to take into our relationships.